Imagine this. You finally stop begging to be understood. Stop shrinking yourself to protect someone else's fragile ego, and instead begin standing in the quiet certainty of your own soul. You expect the storm to end, but strangely, that is when it begins. Not because you became weaker, but because your strength exposed something another person had spent a lifetime trying to hide. There is a moment in every toxic relationship that Carl Jung might describe as the collision between consciousness and the shadow. It is not loud. It does not arrive with dramatic speeches or obvious betrayal. It appears in subtle shifts, in colder eyes, sharper words, unexplained distance, strange accusations that seem to come from nowhere. The narcissistic personality does not fear weakness. Weakness can be manipulated. Weakness can be controlled. What it fears is a woman who no longer depends on its approval for her identity. The strongest woman in the room is rarely the loudest. She is often the quiet one who has survived enough darkness to stop arguing with it. She has looked into her own fears, accepted her own imperfections, and discovered that peace cannot be negotiated through another person's acceptance. This transformation is invisible to many people, but to a narcissist, it is impossible to ignore. Because narcissism survives through mirrors. It requires admiration like lungs require air. It requires emotional reactions to confirm its existence. It needs someone constantly adjusting themselves around its emotional climate. But when that mirror suddenly refuses to reflect the illusion anymore, something ancient awakens inside the narcissistic psyche. Jung believed that whatever remains unconscious eventually controls behavior. The shadow contains everything a person refuses to acknowledge about themselves: shame, fear, envy, insecurity, dependency. The narcissist builds an elaborate false self precisely to avoid confronting this hidden world. Their confidence often masks unbearable emptiness. Their superiority hides profound inferiority. Their certainty conceals terrifying self-doubt. Then she changes. Not overnight. Not because someone rescued her, but because suffering slowly became wisdom. She stopped explaining herself. She stopped defending every misunderstanding. She stopped trying to convince someone to see her value. Without realizing it, she began individuation, the lifelong process Jung described as becoming one's authentic self rather than living according to unconscious patterns. It is one of the most threatening transformations imaginable to anyone whose identity depends on controlling others. Something fascinating begins happening at this stage. The narcissist senses the change long before words confirm it. It appears in her silence. Her slower reactions. The absence of panic. The lack of desperate messages. The way disappointment no longer destroys her entire week. To ordinary people, these seem like healthy emotional boundaries. To the narcissist, they feel like rebellion. Because control is rarely lost through confrontation. It is lost through emotional independence. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. The narcissist cannot understand a soul no longer painted by fear. Their psychological world depends upon emotional dependency. Once dependency disappears, confusion enters the relationship. This confusion quickly transforms into something much darker. Not sadness. Not grief. Fear. The fear of losing supply. The fear of irrelevance. The fear that someone they once considered emotionally owned has become psychologically free. Many women misunderstand what happens next. They expect abandonment. Sometimes that comes. But often something much more sophisticated appears first. A final psychological maneuver. One last desperate attempt to pull the awakened woman back into the unconscious dance. It rarely looks like aggression in the beginning. Instead, it often wears the mask of concern. You've changed. You used to care. You've become cold. You aren't the woman I fell in love with. Notice the hidden message beneath every sentence. Become who you were before your healing. Return to the version of yourself that tolerated disrespect. Come back to the place where your boundaries were flexible enough for my comfort. This is projection at work. Jung explained that people often attribute their own rejected qualities to others because acknowledging them internally feels unbearable. The narcissist accuses her of becoming selfish because they cannot admit their own selfishness. They call her arrogant because her confidence exposes their insecurity. They describe her boundaries as cruelty because they experience every limit as rejection. The remarkable thing is that none of these accusations are really about her. She has become the screen onto which another person's unconscious fears are projected. You may have experienced this yourself. The healthier you became, the more someone insisted you had become the problem. The calmer you remained, the more they described you as emotionally unstable. The less you reacted, the harder they pushed for a reaction. At first, this seems irrational. Psychologically, it is almost inevitable. The unconscious desperately fights against transformation because transformation threatens identity. The narcissistic personality has invested years constructing a fragile psychological empire held together by external validation. Every compliment becomes another brick. Every emotional reaction from others reinforces the illusion of superiority. Then one woman quietly walks away from the game. Not necessarily physically. Emotionally. Spiritually. Psychologically. She stops participating in endless arguments. She stops defending obvious truths. She stops chasing apologies that never arrive. Without announcing it, she removes herself from the narcissist's internal theater. This creates what psychologists sometimes describe as narcissistic injury. But beneath the clinical terminology lies something profoundly human. The collapse of illusion. Seneca observed that no man is free who is not master of himself. The narcissist has mastered appearances. But not himself. Not his fears. Not his emptiness. Not the terrified child hidden beneath layers of superiority. The individuated woman unknowingly becomes dangerous because she represents everything the narcissist has refused to become. Self-aware. Emotionally responsible. Grounded. Whole. Her existence silently asks a question that cannot be tolerated. What if everything the narcissist built was merely armor? Rather than answer that question honestly, another strategy begins emerging. One that appears only when all previous forms of manipulation begin failing. It is subtle. It is cruel. And it is often the final dirty trick before the illusion finally collapses. Most people never recognize it while it is happening because it disguises itself as coincidence, misunderstanding, or even love. But beneath the surface, something much older is unfolding. The shadow, cornered and terrified, is preparing its last defense. And the woman who has awakened must decide whether she will return to the familiar prison, or continue walking toward the unknown freedom waiting beyond it. Freedom always carries an unexpected price. Before it becomes peace, it first feels like isolation. The woman who begins stepping outside unconscious patterns often discovers that the people who once celebrated her kindness become strangely uncomfortable with her confidence. This is not because she has become less loving. It is because love without self-abandonment is unfamiliar to those who benefited from her endless sacrifice. The narcissist understands this instinctively. When admiration no longer works, when intimidation loses its power, when guilt begins slipping through fingers like sand, another weapon quietly emerges from the shadows. It is the weapon of narrative. Every narcissist eventually realizes that controlling a person's reality becomes impossible once they have reclaimed their own mind. But there remains another battlefield, the perceptions of everyone else. Carl Jung warned that the collective unconscious shapes not only individual psychology but also group behavior. Human beings are deeply influenced by shared stories. Tribes survive through common beliefs. Families organize themselves around invisible myths. Entire communities unconsciously choose heroes and villains long before objective truth enters the room. The narcissist knows this, even if only instinctively. If they cannot control the woman herself, perhaps they can control the story about her. This is why the final manipulation is rarely direct confrontation. It is character assassination. Not because revenge feels satisfying. Because reputation becomes the last chain capable of pulling an awakened person back into emotional captivity. Notice how carefully it unfolds. Nothing dramatic at first. Only small suggestions. I'm worried about her. She's been acting differently. I don't even recognize who she's become. I hope she's okay. Each sentence appears compassionate. Each sentence quietly plants suspicion. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its ambiguity. No obvious attack exists to defend against. Every accusation hides inside concern. Every insult disguises itself as empathy. The narcissist creates confusion instead of conflict. Confusion is far more effective. Because confused people begin creating their own explanations. You may remember moments when mutual friends suddenly became distant. Family members started asking strange questions. Coworkers looked at you differently. No one accused you directly. Yet somehow the emotional atmosphere shifted. Invisible. Cold. Unsettling. You searched your memory, wondering whether you had unknowingly done something wrong. This is precisely the emotional terrain where narcissistic manipulation flourishes. Not certainty. Doubt. Because doubt weakens boundaries. Doubt makes healthy people over-explain. Doubt convinces compassionate souls to defend themselves against accusations that were never actually spoken aloud. Jung understood something extraordinary about projection. People do not merely project unwanted qualities onto individuals. They project them onto entire narratives. The narcissist unconsciously writes a story where they remain misunderstood, generous, patient, endlessly forgiving. Someone else must therefore become unstable. Someone else must become selfish. Someone else must carry the shadow they refuse to face. The awakened woman becomes the perfect candidate. Why? Because she no longer participates in maintaining the illusion. Her silence becomes interpreted as arrogance. Her peace becomes interpreted as indifference. Her boundaries become interpreted as hostility. Her healing becomes interpreted as betrayal. The irony is breathtaking. Everything that signifies psychological health begins appearing unhealthy to people deeply invested in dysfunction. Epictetus reminded his students that it is not events themselves that disturb people, but the judgments they make about them. The narcissist depends entirely upon controlling those judgments. Not facts. Interpretations. Imagine a room filled with mirrors. One mirror suddenly reflects reality instead of fantasy. Every distorted mirror surrounding it appears threatened. Rather than correcting themselves, they attempt to shatter the accurate reflection. This is precisely what happens psychologically. The individuated woman becomes a living contradiction to the narcissist's constructed identity. She remembers conversations accurately. She notices inconsistencies. She refuses emotional blackmail. Most importantly, she stops accepting responsibility for emotions that were never hers. That alone destabilizes years of unconscious conditioning. Because narcissistic relationships depend upon borrowed guilt. Someone must constantly apologize. Someone must constantly repair. Someone must constantly wonder whether they are enough. Once she returns responsibility where it belongs, the emotional economy collapses. The narcissist experiences this as abandonment. Not because she actually abandoned anyone. Because she abandoned the role assigned to her. There is an enormous difference. One is cruelty. The other is liberation. Yet liberation always threatens those who benefit from captivity. Marcus Aurelius observed that when another person blames or hates you, you should look directly into their soul and ask what kind of opinions produce such behavior. Doing so removes the need for anger because understanding dissolves illusion. The awakened woman slowly reaches this realization. She begins recognizing that the insults were never descriptions. They were confessions. The accusations were never evidence. They were projections. The manipulation was never proof of her weakness. It was evidence of another person's desperation. This changes everything. Because once projection becomes visible, it loses much of its power. Imagine standing before someone pointing desperately toward a monster behind you. For years you keep turning around, searching, panicking, preparing to defend yourself. Then one day you notice something remarkable. The monster exists only inside the eyes of the person pointing. Nothing stands behind you at all. Everything changes from that moment. You stop looking over your shoulder. You begin looking directly into the psychology creating the illusion. This is the beginning of profound emotional freedom. Yet paradoxically, it also intensifies the narcissist's fear. Why? Because the greatest nightmare for manipulation is awareness. Manipulation depends upon unconscious participation. The instant someone recognizes the pattern begins dying. This explains why the final dirty trick often becomes increasingly irrational. Contradictory stories. Sudden kindness after months of cruelty. Unexpected apologies that vanish once access is restored. Public affection paired with private contempt. Promises of change without genuine accountability. Everything becomes emotionally theatrical. Not because transformation has occurred. Because survival has become urgent. Jung described the shadow as resisting consciousness with astonishing creativity. It would rather create chaos than surrender illusion. The narcissistic psyche follows this exact pattern. As authentic influence disappears, performance intensifies. The stage grows brighter. The acting becomes more convincing. The emotional speeches become more dramatic. Yet beneath every gesture remains the same hidden objective. Return to your old self. Return to confusion. Return to doubting your own perceptions. Return to needing permission to believe what your own soul already knows. But something irreversible has happened inside the woman. She has spent too much time in the darkness to mistake it for home again. The silence she once feared has become sacred. The loneliness she once resisted has become spacious. The approval she once chased has become unnecessary. She still feels sadness. She still mourns. Healing never erases grief. It simply refuses to let grief become identity. And that quiet transformation is precisely what the narcissist cannot comprehend. Because the greatest form of power is not domination over another person. It is becoming impossible to manipulate from within. There comes a stage in every awakening where the battle is no longer between two people. It becomes a confrontation between two identities living within the same soul. One identity still remembers the comfort of pleasing everyone, smoothing every conflict, carrying burdens that never belonged to her. The other has begun listening to something deeper, a quiet inner authority that no longer asks permission to exist. This is where the narcissist makes the most dangerous move of all. Not because it is the loudest. Because it is the most personal. When public narratives begin losing their power. When guilt no longer reaches the heart. When fear no longer commands obedience. The narcissist often reaches for the one place that still feels vulnerable. Memory. Not objective memory. Emotional memory. Old wounds. Forgotten insecurities. The abandoned child hidden beneath the accomplished woman. Carl Jung observed that until the unconscious becomes conscious, it directs life while convincing the individual that fate is responsible. The narcissist instinctively searches for the unconscious wounds that have not yet been fully healed. Every person carries them. Even the strongest woman has scars that occasionally ache beneath the surface. Perhaps she once believed she was difficult to love. Perhaps she grew up believing peace depended on keeping everyone happy. Perhaps affection was unpredictable, arriving only after achievement, silence, or sacrifice. These experiences become psychological doorways. The narcissist has walked through those doors before. Now, realizing they're closing forever, they makes one final attempt to force them open again. Suddenly, memories are rewritten. Moments of abuse become jokes that were misunderstood. Cruelty becomes discipline. Neglect becomes independence. Betrayal becomes something she supposedly imagined. The goal is not simply to change the past. The goal is to make her distrust her own relationship with reality. Modern psychology calls this gaslighting. Jung might describe it as an assault upon consciousness itself. Because individuation depends upon trusting one's direct experience. Once experience is constantly questioned, the path toward authenticity becomes clouded. You may recognize this moment. Someone confidently tells you events happened differently. They deny conversations you remember clearly. They insist your emotions were irrational. Eventually, a strange exhaustion settles in. Not because you are losing your mind. Because your mind has been forced into constant self-defense. Imagine carrying a compass that has always pointed north. Every day, someone insists north is actually south. At first, you argue. Then you explain. Eventually, You begin staring at the compass itself, wondering whether it has been broken all along. This is psychological warfare. Not against your intelligence. Against your confidence in your own perception. The narcissist understands something many people overlook. A woman who trusts herself cannot be easily controlled. Therefore, self-trust becomes the true target. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to one profound discipline: never surrender the authority of your own judgment to another person's passions. This was not merely philosophy. It was psychological survival. The awakened woman slowly begins discovering that truth does not become false simply because another person rejects it. Reality does not disappear because someone lies with conviction. Integrity does not require unanimous agreement. This realization changes the nervous system itself. She reacts differently. Breath slows. Arguments shorten. Silence grows stronger than explanation. The narcissist often mistakes this for emotional coldness. It is something entirely different. Emotional sovereignty. There is immense power in no longer feeling obligated to convince someone committed to misunderstanding you. The old self would have stayed awake all night rehearsing conversations. The new self sleeps peacefully. The old self searched endlessly for the perfect words. The new self recognizes that clarity offered to someone invested in confusion becomes another opportunity for manipulation. Jung believed that symbols communicate what ordinary language cannot. Perhaps the most powerful symbol of individuation is not a crown or a mountain. It is a tree. Consider a great oak. The deeper its roots grow, the less it argues with the wind. Storms still arrive. Branches still bend. Leaves still fall. Yet the tree never abandons itself trying to satisfy the weather. The awakened woman slowly becomes like that tree. Not unfeeling. Deeply rooted. The narcissist cannot comprehend this transformation because everything within their psychological structure depends upon external conditions. Praise creates confidence. Criticism creates collapse. Attention creates identity. Silence creates panic. The individuated woman experiences something entirely different. Her roots descend inward. She begins drawing strength from places invisible to others. Meditation. Reflection. Solitude. Meaning. Purpose. The integration of shadow. She no longer spends every ounce of energy trying to appear perfect. Instead, she becomes whole. There is a profound distinction between perfection and wholeness. Perfection rejects weakness. Wholeness embraces it. Perfection fears mistakes. Wholeness learns from them. Perfection performs. Wholeness simply exists. This is why narcissists often become increasingly frustrated near the end. Nothing they once relied upon produces the desired reaction. The tears become fewer. The explanations disappear. The panic fades. Even anger begins transforming into compassion, not the kind that excuses abuse, but the kind that understands its origin. This is perhaps the greatest victory of all. She begins seeing the frightened child beneath the narcissistic mask. Not to rescue it. Not to heal it. Simply to understand it. Understanding dissolves hatred without eliminating boundaries. Seneca taught that wisdom allows a person to remain compassionate without becoming captive. That distinction saves countless lives. Many women confuse forgiveness with reconciliation. They are not the same. Forgiveness releases poison from the heart. Reconciliation requires genuine transformation from both people. One can exist without the other. The awakened woman discovers she can wish someone healing while refusing to become their emotional prison again. This is not revenge. It is maturity. And maturity is unbearable to anyone who depends upon emotional chaos. By now, the narcissist senses something irreversible. The old version of her is gone. Not hidden. Gone. The woman who once apologized for existing has disappeared. The woman who believed love required suffering has vanished. The woman who confused endurance with devotion no longer answers the door. In her place stands someone unfamiliar. Someone who listens before reacting. Someone who observes before believing. Someone who values peace more than approval. This is why the final trick ultimately fails. It was designed for a woman who no longer exists. The greatest transformations are rarely announced. There is no trumpet sounding across the horizon, no audience applauding the quiet revolution taking place within a human heart. From the outside, very little appears to have changed. She still walks through the same streets. She still carries responsibilities. She still experiences disappointment, grief, uncertainty, and moments when old wounds whisper familiar fears. But something fundamental has shifted. She is no longer asking the world to tell her who she is. Carl Jung believed that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. Yet this becoming is not an act of accumulation. It is an act of surrender. One by one, the false identities begin to fall away. The obedient daughter, the endlessly accommodating partner, the woman who believed love must be earned through exhaustion, the caretaker who measured her worth by how much pain she could endure without complaint. Each identity served a purpose once. Each protected her from a world that often rewarded silence more than authenticity. But every mask eventually becomes too heavy. The narcissist never truly loved those masks. The narcissist depended on them. That is an important difference. Dependency always resists transformation because another person's growth feels like personal loss. The moment she stopped defining herself through another person's emotional needs, the invisible contract between them dissolved. There was never a signature. No spoken agreement. Yet the expectations had always been there. Stay small. Stay available. Stay uncertain. Stay grateful for crumbs. Stay afraid to leave. As long as she unconsciously honored those expectations, harmony appeared to exist. But harmony built upon self-betrayal is merely a beautifully decorated prison. The awakened woman begins recognizing this with startling clarity. She realizes that every time she abandoned herself to preserve someone else's comfort, a small part of her vitality disappeared. Every apology for boundaries weakened her relationship with her own soul. Every attempt to rescue someone unwilling to rescue themselves quietly postponed her own healing. None of this happened because she lacked intelligence. It happened because compassion without discernment becomes vulnerability to manipulation. This is why shadow work is so essential. Many people imagine the shadow contains only anger, jealousy, resentment, or forbidden desires. Yet another part of the shadow is far more subtle. It contains the qualities we were taught were unacceptable. Healthy selfishness, healthy anger, healthy refusal, healthy ambition, healthy distance. A woman praised her entire life for being nice may unconsciously exile her capacity to say no. She may mistake guilt for goodness and self-erasure for generosity. Jung understood that whatever is rejected does not disappear. It waits patiently beneath awareness until life demands its return. The narcissist unintentionally becomes one of life's harshest teachers. Not because abuse is a gift. It is not. Pain should never be romanticized. But suffering often forces hidden strengths into consciousness. The woman who once feared disappointing everyone discovers that disappointment does not destroy her. The woman terrified of being misunderstood discovers that misunderstanding is survivable. The woman who once begged for closure discovers that peace is not something another person grants. It is something cultivated from within. This is the paradox that narcissistic manipulation can never overcome. The more she returns to herself, the less there is to control. Epictetus taught that freedom begins when we distinguish what belongs to us from what does not. Another person's opinion does not belong to us. Another person's projections do not belong to us. Another person's inability to love honestly does not belong to us. Our character does. Our choices do. Our integrity does. The awakened woman slowly rearranges her entire emotional life around this truth. She stops chasing explanations from people committed to misunderstanding her. She stops treating every accusation as a courtroom requiring a defense. She no longer mistakes someone's discomfort with her boundaries for evidence that those boundaries are wrong. Instead, she asks a different question. Does this choice bring me closer to the person my soul recognizes as true? That question changes everything. Because it no longer measures success through applause. It measures success through alignment. The narcissist watches from a distance. often confused by what appears to be indifference. It is not indifference. It is liberation. There is no triumph in humiliating the narcissist. No victory in becoming equally manipulative. No wisdom in allowing bitterness to replace compassion. True individuation refuses both extremes. It neither submits to domination nor becomes domination. It simply stands, calm, present, unmoved by games that once consumed years of precious life. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that the best revenge is not to resemble the person who caused the injury. There is profound psychological truth in those words. When hatred becomes identity, the narcissist continues occupying the mind long after physical absence. When revenge becomes purpose, emotional captivity simply changes form. The truly awakened woman chooses something infinitely more powerful. She chooses herself. Not the wounded self forever seeking validation. Not the frightened self hiding behind perfection. The integrated self. The whole self. The self that has looked directly into loneliness without allowing loneliness to define her. The self that has faced betrayal without allowing betrayal to destroy her capacity for love. The self that has embraced both light and shadow, strength and tenderness, confidence and humility. This is what makes her untouchable. Not because pain can never reach her again. Life will always contain loss. People will continue projecting their unresolved wounds. Some relationships will still end. Some hearts will still disappoint. But she no longer abandons herself when those storms arrive. She has become her own safe place. And perhaps that is the deepest secret hidden beneath every journey of individuation. The goal was never to become invincible. It was to become authentic. Because authenticity cannot be manipulated. A person may lose status, lose relationships, lose approval, lose comfort. Yet someone who remains faithful to their own soul has lost nothing essential. The narcissist's final dirty trick ultimately reveals far more about the prison of the manipulator than the strength of the woman being targeted. The last attack is not proof that she failed. It is often the clearest evidence that she finally escaped the role written for her by someone else's unconscious. She walks forward carrying no need to convince, no desire to retaliate, and no hunger for validation. Only quiet certainty. Only inner peace. Only the freedom that comes from no longer betraying herself to keep someone else comfortable. Because in the end, a woman who has integrated her shadow no longer fears another person's darkness. She recognizes it. She understands it. And then she calmly keeps walking. A woman who knows her worth does not pursue, she chooses.